Good afternoon, live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave, implications on the economy. I'm your host, Andy Hodges. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune in to Capi Talk Economic Panorama on Thursday at 3 p.m. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimbabwe's TV network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Zimbabwe is currently experiencing a second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. As of the 14th of January 2021, Zimbabwe had 25,368 confirmed cases, including 14,714 recoveries and, tragically, 636 deaths. Given the limited testing capacity, analysts believe that the actual numbers could be much higher than these official figures. The Zimbabwean government has introduced a 30-day stringent level 4 lockdown from the previous level 2, with non-essential services being shut down. Now, given that 76% of total employment in the country is informal, this could imply once again significant loss of employment and income for the majority of Zimbabwe's citizens. The expected economic recovery of 2021 is under threat and could be subdued and weaker than initially expected, unless the government acts decisively to deal with the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic second wave. According to the World Bank, January 2021 global economic prospects, the Zimbabwean economy is forecast to recover from -10% in 2020 to 2.9% in 2021. Zimbabwe's Ministry of Finance is estimating a 2021 growth rate of 7.5%. The World Bank figures are much lower than the 4% projected global economic growth. According to the same report, the rising government indebtedness represents a significant downside risk for the economy, given the huge pressures on the government's balance sheet. Now, this program seeks to discuss the implications of the COVID-19 second wave on the Zimbabwean economy. And to help us do that, we are joined in studio by Prosper Chitambara, a development economist at the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. And joining us virtually is Professor Gift Mugano, one of Zimbabwe's leading economists. Prosper, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Now, in our first segment, we ask, was a level 4 lockdown necessary and appropriate? How will the lockdown affect the Zimbabwean economy, citizens, SMEs and business? And how will Zimbabwe's informal sector survive? Prosper, in my opening, you heard of the rising case of infections, and more tragically, as I said, the deaths being caused by the second wave of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. The government has responded, of course, by announcing the level 4 30-day lockdown. So your comments on the government's response, was it appropriate and necessary?
I think let me also start by saying that I think we relaxed a bit, especially in December. And obviously, I think that also resulted in the number of cases actually going up. A relaxation in terms of even our behavior, in terms of masking up, in terms of social distancing, and also even relaxation in terms of the enforcement of the health protocols, of the restrictions, of the measures. And so I would not probably agree with maybe level 4. Probably we should have moved to level 3, at least allow the rest of the economic sectors to continue to operate, especially given the structural changes that have taken place in our economy, where we have seen a lot of informalization, rather, of the economy. So the majority of our employed population is actually in the informal economy. So the lockdown level 4 will really affect these ones more adversely through loss of income.
I mean, it's interesting. I was speaking to the Tanzanian ambassador, and they haven't locked down the formal.
Oh, they haven't. Actually, in science, there is no consensus. I think the lockdowns are a bit controversial. There's no consensus in terms of the effectiveness of lockdowns. Do they really flatten the curve, or they just flatten the economy? Actually, some scientists actually claim that lockdowns probably they just postpone the deaths and the cases. Because you can't lock down the economy forever. At some point, you have to go on. Life has to go on.
Let me put it to you then. I mean, the second wave of the COVID pandemic, how will it affect the Zimbabwean economy and especially businesses?
I think it will have a negative effect in terms of, number one, weakening productivity, because obviously when more people are sick, it affects the levels of productivity and competitiveness. There's also going to be loss of production, loss of revenues, production by businesses, which will affect revenues by those businesses, and also ultimately even fiscal revenues to government. And obviously that's going to weaken our economic recovery. And there are a lot of uncertainties and a lot of volatility with respect to how long is this lockdown going to last, with respect to how soon are we going to roll out the vaccination. So I think all those uncertainties obviously will affect.
I mean, it can be said that the Minister of Finance didn't anticipate this. I mean,
no one really anticipated it.
Yeah, we
never really anticipated
have suddenly another
second wave. Yeah.
We're now joined virtually by Professor Gift Mugano. Gift, welcome to the Men Special.
Thank you.
Gift, you've heard what Prosper's been saying in the studio here. Let me get your views on the effects of the level 4 lockdown on the economy, citizens and business.
Look, I think Prosper has been very clear. I agree with him. For me, I feel that we could have done better by avoiding recklessness, which we saw at the border. Now we are dealing with the spilled milk, and we cannot do much. Where I see it, it's a controversial issue. I feel the lockdown was necessary now because we were now in a situation which was like a time bomb. And of course, what is very critical is to reduce the time of the lockdown because it is going to kill. We're going to die more of hunger than COVID-19, particularly when you bring in the informal sector, taking into account that there are millions of people in that sector. In fact, last time when the study was done by World Bank, there were 5.7 million people in 2012.
In fact, Gift, it takes me to my next question, in fact, because the previous hard lockdown in 2020, the middle of last year, I mean, it led to loss of income, increased poverty levels, and numerous businesses and SMEs were shutting down. And as I said earlier, given that 76% of total employment in the country is informal, how effective are lockdowns, given that most citizens simply cannot afford economically to actually stay at home?
At some point, it's not going to be effective. Right now, people are sitting indoors because of the legislation that we should stay indoors. But clearly, when you are starving, you have to get out because, in any way, either way, you are going to die. I'm sure if you look around as well, there's a lot of vending taking place because remember, these people, they survive on a day-to-day basis, make enough income. So I think as we are discussing, and we know policymakers are listening, what is very critical is then to carry out a thorough and excessive testing in all the areas, particularly hotspot, to be able to understand the severity of that disease and then be able to reduce the lockdown. As Prosper was saying, lockdown alone is not useful until you are doing something during the lockdown. And testing and education and also treatment is one way which can be done during the lockdown. And I don't think we've done much on that direction.
I mean, I went recently around some of the suburbs around the capital, Harare, and it appears that wearing of masks, social distancing, and so forth, as you said, vending is continuing. It doesn't seem to be taken as seriously as it should, I felt, by citizens in those areas.
Correct, as you are rightly saying. People aren't taking it seriously because that's why I wanted to talk about education, awareness as well. Because you can't even just driving around the location in trucks as government officials with their siren telling people it's very important, right? Then of course testing, but the whole idea is to shorten the time of the lockdown because we cannot hold this economy from breathing.
Let me ask you both, starting with you, Prosper. Results from a number of studies have shown that lockdowns do have an adverse implication on poverty through significant loss of income, for example. So how will citizens, the informal sector and business survive under the new stringent lockdown? What strategies must they put in place? And what must the government do to mitigate the lockdown-induced poverty?
I think in terms of the role of government, I think that's where targeted social protection, social welfare comes in. But in terms of how can they cope, those in the informal, the loss of jobs, the loss of employment, I think it's very, very difficult. There's a study that's been done by the UN which has seen that people really have adopted various coping strategies. Number one being a reduction of consumption. And obviously that raises the risk of stunting, of malnutrition, because in most cases, children are the worst affected by the reduction in consumption. Then also we've seen asset stripping, especially by rural households. They've had to sell assets at a song in order to raise funds or incomes to mitigate the effect of the lockdowns. So I think most of the coping strategies really have adverse welfare implications on the ordinary citizen. I think that's where then the role of social protection becomes important. Because countries that are doing well have advanced social welfare systems, what we call a developmental welfare state model, that at least guarantees a basic income grant, especially to the marginalized and to the vulnerable.
Right. I mean, in Africa, of course, does suffer from, I mean, if you look at the Western world, they've obviously got national health services.
Exactly.
They've got very, very fundamental health for everybody.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Africa, of course, is lagged behind.
Most
of Africa, in fact, including South Africa, is lagged behind.
South Africa also,
Gift, let me ask you the same question, because I mean, I think from a parent's perspective, of course, schools are still closed. I'm not sure, I can't remember when children went to school last, but it must be sometime towards the middle of last year. So your comment on what in informal sector businesses, how they can survive under this new stringent lockdown. I mean, bearing in mind that 30 days could be extended, and you know, what could government do to mitigate more of our people sinking into poverty?
Right. First and foremost, the informal sector cannot survive this lockdown because they have little income, and right now, as we are speaking, they are eating their capital. The study by World Bank shows that 85% of capital in the informal sector is personal savings, what they save every day. So what is very critical now, to answer your question on what government must do, what they can only do is to shorten the lockdown, right? We've made mistakes by allowing people to come in this country. You know, you're talking about Tanzania. Tanzania did not lock down, but they managed their borders very well. So what we need to do is to clear this excess of COVID which came into our system by testing and be very clear in terms of the prevalence, where is it hotspot. Then avoid a blanket lockdown as we go. We then begin to open. That's what the government must be focusing on. Government has no capacity to give bailout packages to the informal sector as big as it is. If you look at our fiscal space, it's very tight. So what we can only do within our means is to do testing, quarantining, and separating hotspots, and begin to have a first opening up, right? And also developing new regulations which are going to be affecting people differently. There are some informal sectors which are a bit more organized. You can't just say informal sectors, all of them must be shut. So we need now to understand it better, this, and become more organized as we are during the pandemic.
Would you advocate, like other countries have done, different tiers of lockdown? I know some countries have started at tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and they've obviously put that into various areas in the country. Hotspots are at level 4, and those areas which are more remote and with less populations are maybe a tier 1 or tier 2.
Precisely, that's what I'm saying. And it can be informed by studies, and it's very easy to study this, because if you look at this country, in every province there's a university, right? And the government can pick that information to see which regulation can be defined for a particular area. Why would you lock down Chimanimani? Why? For what reason? You see, because you then just need to block the movement, of those people, and you also test along the road to make sure that those who want to proceed to Chimanimani should be clear. They don't have COVID. So that is what we should do, because this COVID is with us for some time.
Yeah, nothing is going away. Prosper, before we take a breather, just a quick comment.
And that's a very good observation by Gift. I think we need to strengthen and increase our testing capacity, our tracing, and our isolation. Even testing on the roads, temperature, and if the temperature is too high, probably then test for the COVID itself. I think that would be critical. But the blanket lockdown, I think, is not effective. I think we need to be more strategic and identify the hotspots so we can isolate those.
I think we will in our next segment look at how government can actually afford to do this, because as much as my guests are talking about testing, it does cost money, but we will talk about that. It's now time for us to take a short breather. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpapers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave, implications on the economy. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Now, after the breather, we ask, does Zimbabwe have a clear strategic plan to deal with the COVID-19 outside of lockdowns? Will Zimbabwe introduce another stimulus package? And if so, how will it fund it? And how will the country build a resilient and recovering economy after the COVID-19 pandemic has hopefully gone? The Min Special will be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave implications on the economy. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capi Talk every Thursday at 3 p.m. Gift, some critics have argued that the Zimbabwean government does not have a clear actionable strategic plan and response beyond these lockdowns. Do you believe this is a fair critique?
It is a fair critique. We were arguing even last year that we need to do a proper assessment to see how can we then move out of this lockdown and what kind of interventions which we must then apply in these sectors to revise them. Up to now, there's no government minister who can put a paper on the table that this is a strategy. We don't have that. So that's a clear sign that we don't have a strategy to deal with this aftermath of the lockdown. And that is why we were not even able to see that COVID-19 is coming back. So when you have a proper strategy, you also have your risk matrix on that same problem. And why we missed it that is coming. In fact, if you look at the assumption of the national budget statement of 2021, one of the first assumptions on number one was that there's improvement in COVID-19 in 2021. So we don't have it. I think it's a fair critique, and we should face it head on and be able then to respond to it adequately.
First, for your comment?
I think I agree. I think that's the perception and probably the fact also on the ground. Yeah. And of course, we've heard government saying that they're coming up with a vaccination strategic framework to guide the rolling out of the vaccine program. But I think there's need to ensure that we adopt a whole of society approach where we ensure the process is inclusive and also it's based on science. Yeah.
That takes me to my next question, funnily enough, because a number of countries have increased their stimulus packages to deal with the second wave of the pandemic. In your view, can the country afford an increase in the stimulus package to combat the second wave, especially given the downside risk of rising government indebtedness? And simply put, does Zimbabwe have enough money, or where can we find it? And now here I'm looking at things, for example, you both mentioned increased testing, you looked at looking at hotspots, and also another subject that came up through some of our viewers, of course, is if you do get COVID, the actual cost of treatment. It's quite prohibitive. I believe some hospitals are asking for about $3,000 for you to even get into the hospital for treatment. So how possibly can government afford this at the moment?
I think it's very, very difficult, especially also given the fact that most of our public health institutions have been stretched to the limit. I think the fact is that we don't have a lot of fiscal degrees of freedom to be able to maneuver or to even to come up with a second fiscal package. when you look at how most countries have been financing these fiscal packages, it's really largely borrowings, especially local borrowings, and also even printing money. I think that's what we have seen in both developed and even developing economies. And Zimbabwe, I think you can't really afford that. And also, critically, we are not sure what happened to the first stimulus package. I think there's been a lot of opacity around how much money has actually been distributed, who has actually benefited from the first initial package. But obviously, you then need to do a lot of financial engineering, a lot of juggling to see where you can reallocate resources and put resources into those critical or high priority sectors.
I mean, it's a chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean,
on
the one side, government needs to spend money, or hopefully to help the more vulnerable citizens in our society. On the other side, of course, they don't want to be printing money, which will obviously tank our economy,
or even borrowing which will crowd out the
inflation goes out and so forth.
Yeah.
Gift, funding of the COVID-19 stimulus package, even in 2020, was a cause for concern. Your brief comment on how the Zimbabwean government can continue to fund if it does introduce any form of stimulus package?
I think the best way to get stimulus package for this COVID-19 is to stop corruption, and then use that man which was supposed to be corrupted to COVID-19. We have lost billions in this country. We don't even need to go and get funding from any multilateral financial institution. Right, so that's number one. In my view, if we can stop all the leakages and account for it, we can deliberately put that money into industry, and we have that opportunity to do that.
But isn't one of the problems with that argument, of course, is that the process of recovering corrupt proceeds is a long process. It isn't something that's quick, and also leakages in the economy is tough to do.
It's not about recovering what has been stolen. It's about closing the leakages which are known, right? The leakages are known, and close them, quantify it, demonstrate it. Look at the Auditor General's report on how much money has been corrupted by various government departments. So, for example, if we have a zero corruption for 2021, government can then demonstrate that this year there was no corruption. So we can sacrifice what was being put into pockets by thieves. Right, that's number one. Then the second aspect, which I would want to argue in agreement with Prosper, is that because government does not have the latitude to print money or to set funds aside for COVID-19, the best stimulus package is macroeconomic stability, right? Well, Zimbabweans are very innovative, but they want a grounded, stable macroeconomic environment for them to be able to do their financial engineering in their own respective businesses. I mean, it's very clear that we can't put money in this whole COVID outside the recovery or the savings from corruption. So the economy should be run in a stable manner. And the third point, the final point, we need to have a well-managed lockdown, as we have discussed it before, because in its own way, like Prosper is saying, we should not have gone it for stage 4, we should have been stage 3. Is it correct? Right. If it is correct,
right,
we've missed an opportunity.
Before I ask Prosper to comment on what you've said, I just want to ask you this, because one area, of course, of concern is as well as the government having to address, together with private sector, of course, to address the current COVID-19 second wave, we've also got to look at how we can build a fair and resilient economic recovery after the second wave or from COVID-19. And some have argued that a bold, targeted fiscal expansion, let's put it simply, public spending, is the only way to do that. I mean, so what can the country do to ensure that there's required fiscal space to implement this expansion? Because as you said, on the one side you've got the COVID pandemic, which is putting strain on the fiscus. On the other side, of course, we don't want to have inflation creeping back. We don't want money supply growth coming in and the exchange rate moving. It's a fine balancing act government has to walk along.
Very, very good question, and thank you for bringing that question. First, we are not very good in dealing with excessive money supply or expanding the fiscal space, maybe through printing money, or running a budget deficit. We aren't very good in the economics of managing it to be production-oriented. But in economics, my conviction and my understanding that if there's nothing wrong about a budget deficit if you are funding production, and this production should then be linked to the enhancement of macroeconomic stability. For example, If you fund production and you guarantee that you have excess in agricultural produce, which you can export and save foreign currency, it's good. And then that can sustain the business. But our history for the last 20 years or so speaks very dead of our experience in that direction. And I will not advocate for that. What I would rather advocate for is a case where government can give some tax reprieve, like you then minimize the level of taxation going to these businesses for them to have savings on their own. And then they will be able to demonstrate that money back into production. So these taxes, for example, you could say, in this sector, we take out the 2%, but you should then be able to give us this level of production. So it's on achievement, right? That is the best way to go because you give private sector that responsibility to use that money.
Right, because, but I mean, if just very briefly, if you minimize taxation, of course, you have to increase production, otherwise government revenue will go down. So in a way, if the money is not used productively, government will be in a worse hole than it was before the tax breaks, if they ever issued them.
Correct.
Okay. Prosper, your comments. I mean, you heard Gift there. He's saying the best way to fund the stimulus package is to stop corruption and also leakages as well, and known leakages and corruption, so to speak. Particularly, he cited the Auditor General's report, for example, and also his recommendation of putting in maybe tax breaks, something to maximize production rather than government possibly public work programs, which have worked around the world at various times. This is a different time we're in at the moment. What would be your comment to this?
I think I largely agree. If you are increasing fiscal spending to finance production, I think for me that would be very positive. Even if you have to borrow money to encourage or to encourage production, strengthen the productive capacity of the economy, I think that would be good. So I definitely agree. But also closing the leakage is also very, very important. I think there's a lot of money that's actually leaking out of the system. And once we have the right political will and commitment to do that, I'm sure we'll be able to raise enough fiscal space to finance some of the critical things that need to be financed in terms of our post-COVID recovery. I mean,
before we get to the breather, there's just one thing I'd like to ask you, because we always talk about the government, but private sector has a role to play. Surely. Definitely. So what role can private sector do to make sure that we do have this resilient economy going forward, particularly during this COVID-19 second wave and hopefully when the wave is abated?
I think what's clear here is that there's a huge financing gap in terms of what needs to be financed because of the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's where also the private sector could come in. But for the private sector to come in, I think they also need incentives. I think it's all about incentive. If they have the right kind of tax incentives, I think we'll be able to unlock greater involvement and participation of the private sector. And not just private sector, even also other stakeholders and constituencies like the diaspora. They can also play a critical role in terms of bridging the huge financing gap. I think we've seen what has happened in terms of the huge improvements in official remittance inflows into the country. I think that's positive, and that needs to be encouraged and to be harnessed more towards the productive sectors of the economy. I think going forward, I think that's one of the key lessons.
And one school of thought, of course, is diaspora remittances have gone up because, of course, we've had a stable exchange rate, a Dutch auction system, so now people can send their money to banks, get their official exchange rate, rather than what they were doing previously, sending it to middlemen or parallel market.
I think that's very, very positive. But I think going forward, we need to harness more of that into the productive sector of the economy.
Well, it's now time for us to take a short breather. So should you have any comments or views on our show, as I've said, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave, implications on the economy. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Now, after the breather, we ask, can Zimbabwe learn any lessons from other countries in terms of comprehensively, sustainably, and effectively responding to the COVID-19 second wave? Does the COVID-19 crisis present any opportunities for Zimbabwe? And what now is my guest's economic outlook, bearing in mind the COVID-19 second wave? What is their economic outlook and growth projections for 2021? The Mint Special will be right back. Don't go away.
Life will never be the same again.
Absolutely. How do you tell someone in Mbare or in Soweto that they should exercise social distancing.
Every single one of us, barring a few, are praying more. What is the health economic cost of what we are trying to achieve?
I don't know whether his chairman knows he runs at about 9 in the morning.
Yeah, I've just got symptoms, so I just called the doctor and and then he just advised me to have to stay at home, eh?
Welcome back to the mid-special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave, implications on the economy. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Cappy Talk every Thursday at 3 p.m. Prosper, what lessons can Zimbabwe draw from other countries? I talked about dealing with the COVID-19 comprehensively, sustainably, and effectively. In fact, can Zimbabwe also draw any lessons from its own previous hard lockdown that was put around, I think it was April last year, 2020?
I think for me, the major lesson here that we can learn is that we need to strengthen our disaster preparedness. Because when a crisis are bound to happen, and when a crisis happens, I think what really matters the most is what we have actually been doing before the crisis happens to prepare yourselves for the crisis. And a major lesson that I saw from countries that did well or that are doing well in terms of their response and in terms of the financial sustainability of that response is the importance of having a strong savings culture, a domestic savings culture. We saw it in the Nordic countries. We saw it in the Middle East countries, and we also saw it in most Asian economies. I think they have a strong savings culture. They've come up with what are called sovereign wealth funds. And we saw most of those governments actually drawing down on those sovereign wealth funds to create fiscal space or the fiscal legroom to be able to finance their response. And also we saw the importance of having a strong public health system, a strong welfare system, a strong infrastructure system, water and sanitation system. I think that's very, very key. I think going forward, I think those are the areas that we need, I think, to be really focusing on working on our savings and also working on our basic infrastructure.
Social services.
Oh, exactly.
Okay, all right. Gift, I'd like you to comment on that, but I also want to ask you this. What are the social protection implications of the COVID-19 second wave to Zimbabwe? In particular, how can the government ensure that social protection interventions are effective and sustainable? I mean, I'll give you an example. In 2020, the government said that there was 1 million vulnerable citizens who were targeted for COVID-19 aid, but really only a small percentage of those people actually received assistance. And in fact, looking at various reports, poverty numbers actually increased in the country. Your comment?
Yeah, I agree with Prosper, particularly having a solid social health system, social protection, safety net mechanism. You are aware that the Department of Social Welfare has a mechanism of distributing food, particularly to the people who are vulnerable. And they have an interesting and very respected criteria mechanisms which they use, whether you are feeding, breastfeeding, or you are an adult, elderly, and disadvantaged. Very clear. But the challenge now is the issue of the resource base, which we have, where one would then recall that government, I think last year they were giving $300 per month. And that's $3 equivalent, right? It's not $2. Below to $3. So the whole issue is that we need to have a robust system, what the Prosper said. But over and above, for us to have resilience in this pandemic, we must maintain and sustain a stable macroeconomic environment. Imagine if we had, for the last 20 years, a sustainable economy, which is growing at a sustainable rate. We have a lot of money in pension funds, right? Which we can draw. I'm just adding what over and above what Prosper said, and that money will be available to mitigate these consequences, these negative effects as bailout packages. But right now, everyone is broke. The pension funds are broke. The insurance sector is broke because of capital erosion, which was caused by higher inflation. In fact, we have lost our currency twice in 10 years. So it is teaching us that we should be able to run this economy in a pragmatic way. We should sustain macroeconomic stability. We should drive into high upper income, middle income status, so we are able to have an economy which shield any problem which is coming. We must build reserves of foreign currency to have a stable currency. So South Africa, they can print their money easily because they have reserves. They have a stable economy. But if you print money here to fund social programs, you are in hell.
Right.
So this issue of macroeconomic stability is very key going forward as well.
I mean, Prosper, I mean, you know, it's a two-part question here, but one thing I can suppose which has happened, and thank God for this, of course, is the rains. And one of the issues, of course, was hunger, particularly through COVID-19, people not having enough money. But hopefully the rain should give us a good agricultural season and hopefully a good harvest, because every crisis does contain, unfortunately, great opportunities. And the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe, is no different. So what key opportunities and lessons do you believe can be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? And even now, if we talk about the second wave, let's just talk about COVID-19 in general.
I think a key opportunity that's emerging is, number one, how we can leverage the digital economy to strengthen the resilience of the economy. I think we have seen the importance of the digital economy with the lockdowns, with schools being shut. I think it becomes very, very important to have a strong digital economy that's actually able to cater for the digital needs of scholars, of every economic agent actually in the economy. So I think we need to be putting a lot of emphasis, I think, going forward on how we can fully digitize the economy, embrace e-government. And also by doing that, we're actually helping to deal with the issues of the leakages and corruption. Because once we have a fully digitized, for example, doing business environment, actually removing platforms and opportunities for rent seeking, for corruption, for bureaucrats to ask for golden handshakes from potential investors.
So I suppose we're talking about the almost rejigging of the economy.
Yeah,
into
definitely.
more digital,
Reorienting the economy.
Reorientating, and also I suppose more jobs in sectors that Zimbabwean youth weren't really involved in before. I think more and more youth are getting into these sectors which weren't typical of our employment.
Exactly, a few years ago. And it also means we need to reorient our education system so that at least we also focus on the digital skills, imparting the right kind of digital skills, so at least most of our youth can be able to benefit from some of the opportunities through the digital economy.
Finally, I want to ask you both, and Gift, let me start with you. When Zimbabwe's Minister of Finance announced the 2021 budget in November 2020, no one then spoke about a second wave and a possible prolonged lockdown in the country. In fact, you mentioned the preamble to the budget talked about improvement in COVID-19. So in view of the uncertainties and this second wave that the second wave has brought, what now is your economic outlook and projection for 2021? Has it changed from the last time we spoke? I believe we did a show here with Ledriz late last year where we spoke about the economic forecast for 2021. What would you say now about the forecast for this year?
Thank you, Andy. I am still bullish that this economy will perform well in 2021. Yes, we can debate about the final figure in terms of economic growth rate. One might say 7.4 might be too high, but I think anything in the region of 5% is achievable. Only and if only, these are the conditions. That one, we manage the lockdown, we implement the policy recommendation that we provided here in terms of it being well organized, avoiding a blanket, having a clear strategy for managing it going forward. The whole idea is to get out of a lockdown a number of sectors and a number of regions, and then be able to manage even the movement of people. The whole idea, we need to manage the lockdown, how we are going to be interacting forward. We must not panic. If we keep on locking down in a wholesale level, then we are going to have a negative growth this year. But we want to avoid that because we can avoid that. So if we do what I'm talking about, we can have a positive growth rate. What is also refreshing is that, as you said in a previous remark, we have a good rain, and I think there were a lot of efforts which were put into agriculture this year. And knowing that we spent $1.2 billion in importing agricultural produce. We are on course to save at least close to $800 million of foreign exchange. And I think, in my view, we can look at it as aid. We have created our own artificial aid, which can then be available to finance this economy because we are preserving foreign currency. So I feel that the agricultural sector would be a game changer. And it's good that the government did not lock down the agricultural sector on this lockdown, so as other supporting sectors within the value chain. So I still feel that we can still manage to have a reasonable growth rate in 2021.
Prosper, let me come to you finally as my final question. You know, I mean, governments seem to have inflation sort of coming down under control. In fact, I think the last inflation figure was around 350 around that area, down from just over 400%. Month-on-month inflation 2.5%, which is way below what we were experiencing beginning of 2020. Money supply growth seemed to be under control, at least the official figures that were given. Things looked as if we were taking the first steps towards an economic recovery in 2021. So your view, do we still anticipate that? Do you still anticipate that? Do you still anticipate the Minister of Finance forecast that he put in his budget? Are they sort of achievable?
I mean, look, yes, there are uncertainties, but I believe this year is going to be better than next year. But of course, this is dependent on our agricultural season. I hope we are going to end well in terms of our rainfall. And also what happens in terms of coming up with a robust response, I think, to this second wave. I think we need to be strategically reopening the economy and forcing some of those health protocols without necessarily locking down people. I think going forward, I think that's what we need to do here. But I'm bullish that this year will be better than last year.
Nice.
I'm not sure of the 7.5 official projection by the Minister of Finance, whether that's going to be realizable. But the World Bank are projecting 2.9%, and I probably would put my range between 2% and 4%.
Okay, well, at least both of my guests are bullish, and I think on that note, it's a good time to end our program this afternoon. You've been watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 second wave, implications on the economy. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Of course, please don't miss Economic Panorama on Capi Talk every Thursday at 3 p.m. I'd like to thank our guests this afternoon, Prosper Chitambara, a development economist at the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, and Professor Gift Mugano, an economist. Gentlemen, thank you so much for appearing on the Mint Special.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. A final comment. At the end of 2020, Zimbabweans could rightfully look forward and possibly see a light at the end of the tunnel, economically, for 2021. Inflation was on the downward track. Prices of basic commodities, goods and services had stabilized. The rains had come, filling us with hope of a good and plentiful agricultural season. There was optimism and, dare I say it, hope once again. Then before the new year was even upon us, the country was again plunged into a level 4 lockdown caused by a second wave of COVID-19. A lockdown which, although put in place for 30 days, we're not sure, but could be extended even further. SMEs and businesses have started to recover. The informal economy has started to find its feet again, all of which could be set back by the second wave of the pandemic. How the Zimbabwean government, the private sector, and even Zimbabwean citizens react to the new normal or new level 4 lockdown will determine, not to be too dramatic, the economic future of our nation, especially in the short term. Will vulnerable citizens receive the aid they desperately need? How will the informal economy, most of which live from hand to mouth, survive a new prolonged lockdown? Will poverty levels increase? Will businesses be able to maintain production without being forced to increase prices of their goods and services? The future may be uncertain, but what cannot be is our reaction to the second wave. Zimbabwe needs to learn from our experiences from 2020. We have been here before. This time, let's just do it better. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and please, you all be safe.